What is up, most distinguished patrons of this channel? Today we're going to be tackling the age-old question, push versus pull with short arc MIG. And I say this is an age-old question because it's still hotly debated, and a lot of people have very strong opinions on one or the other, and obviously one of them has to be better, so we can't all be right. So why don't we do a whole bunch of tests and see what happens? Let's get into it. All right, two no-expense spared drawings. We have a push and a pull with short arc MIG. What I find when I do both of these, because while I'm watching the arc and seeing what's going on, is that when I push, it's very difficult to keep that wire hitting in this area right here where the root of the joint is. So say this is a fillet weld, okay? That wire, depending on what your gun angle is and depending on how much wire speed you're running, this molten puddle starts building up and the wire ends up shorting out up here and not down here. And to make it worse, the arc force kind of pushes the weld material out up to the upright plate over here and onto the horizontal plate if you're welding in a flat position, which makes it even more difficult to keep that wire on the leading edge of the puddle. And after a certain point, you simply you can't do that. And if you know anything about short arc MIG, say this is your molten puddle and your metal that you're depositing, and this is the wire coming in it. Short arc MIG does not have much penetration to begin with, and when you're trying to weld through molten metal, the distance between here and here is going to prevent root fusion down in here. So by simply not welding through the puddle and staying on the leading edge, you get more root fusion down in here than you would if you're riding the puddle. So when you push, sometimes you have to run higher travel speed. Under no circumstances should you be running really low settings and keeping that wire feeding in like back here. You want to try and stay up here the best you can. Now when you pull, what ends up happening is the wire hits this area in front of the puddle and the puddle kind of gets pushed back this way. And the point of doing that is that, well, if it gets pushed back there, this section right here is going to be thinner. It's easier to stay on the leading edge. And rather than this big, thick weld pool, your wire has to come through this much of a weld pool, so much thinner, and you typically would get better root fusion. Now, the other difference between these two is when you push, it tends to spread the weld out and produce a flatter weld that the toes are not really wetted in better, but just flatter. When you pull, it tends to produce a bead that's more roped up. It still has excellent fusion and typically better than pushing, but it visually looks different. Which if you're doing a multi-pass weld on say 1/4 inch or 3/8 plate, you're probably better off pulling on the root pass, and then you can push on the two cover passes where the root fusion isn't so much of a concern because you're essentially just filling out the material. You don't need root fusion because there's no root to fuse there, if you understand what I'm saying. So I think this is covered good enough. This is a lot of the theory. Now let's actually do a bunch of welds and then test them and see really what's going on, if it does make a difference or not. All right, so let's have a quick recap of where we're at. All of these are labeled. The S stands for straight in, the P stands for push, the PL stands for pull, which you can kind of tell wherever the stop of the weld is. If it's on the right side, obviously I pulled it. If it's on the left side, I pushed it because I'm right-handed. So that's all simple. I got 3/8 plate here, 1/4 inch plate here, 1/4 here. What we're going to start out with is these guys right here where I did a simple, not the best, not the worst, pull versus push on flat plate. I'm going to cut and etch this, and we're going to look at the results of it, and that will kind of give us a tone of what to expect on all of these. So let me go and cut these and let's look at it. All right, so I cut and etched the push and the pull. Why don't we look at both of them together? So my travel speed was dictated by the weld height, and you can see both of these are basically the same height off the plate. but the penetration profiles of them are completely different. The pull has more penetration, however the bead isn't nearly as wide or as flat. Now, had I slowed down on the pull, essentially it would have just roped up even higher, and it wouldn't have really penetrated more, and it wouldn't have wetted out to the sides more. So that's kind of a limitation. But this mirrors the results in the previous videos where pushing, generally speaking, lost penetration versus pull. Now let's look at some arc footage pushing. I'm going to play it in real time and not comment at first, and then I'm going to slow it down and comment. So in the slow motion footage, pay attention to where the wire's actually hitting the molten puddle. It's hitting roughly in, I would say, the end of the first third of the puddle towards the middle. And this is about the best you can do to stay on the leading edge when you push. You're simply welding through far more molten puddle than when you pull, and that's likely why there's increased penetration with short arc when you pull. Let's look at pulling now. So now in the slow motion of the previous video, you can see how that wire is hitting the absolute front of the puddle and it's pushing the molten metal backwards. You're not really welding through much of a thickness of molten metal at all, which is likely why the penetration is better with pulling. So for comparison's sake, if you look at these two pictures, the top is pushing, the bottom is pulling, and you can see where the wire is hitting. Clearly, when you pull, it's hitting the leading edge where there really isn't any molten metal to weld through. In the pushing, you're hitting more or less the first third to the middle. Now, you could travel even faster than what I was doing in the pushing. The problem is that you're going to lose the molten puddle. Like, you have to drag the puddle along with you because that's where your molten metal is. And if you lose that trying to outrun it, well then for one, you're going to deposit too small of a weld, and two, you're not really going to melt anything because you won't have a molten puddle. All right, let's move on. So on the best case scenario flat plate, we saw subtle differences. Now on this test, the flat plate, I think the differences will be somewhat masked. When we actually look at the fillet welds, I think the differences will be far more pronounced with the push versus pull, and that's because that root has to get fused to get strength, and a small difference in a flat plate can add up to huge on a fillet weld. And that's why the next thing we're going to do is brake test these. So let's get this in a vise and get set up and break them. All right, so let's start out with the pull weld. These are all 1/4-inch plates. The average brake strength on these should be around 90 foot-pounds. If we see something far under that, that would indicate pretty poor root fusion. And once we get through breaking all of these, we'll look at them up close. And I think that if there is a big difference in the torque it takes to break them, we'll see evidence in root fusion problems when we inspect them in a minute. All right, let's break this. So 69 foot-pounds, which that's not necessarily out of the ordinary. I guess this is 1/4-inch plate, but we'll find out if there's differences. And that was straight in. This is push. And 98, so that's pretty typical, I would say. So the straight in definitely was weaker, which my prediction is it had poorer fusion in the root. Now let's look at the pull. And it's actually not going to break. I'm at 136 foot-pounds and it did not break. So that's a pretty good result. I ran out of travel here, so yeah, it's not going to break. So stronger. Well, I'm going to hit them with a hammer and finish them off, and we'll take a look at the results on the inside of it. All right, so this is a straight-in weld, and it failed at the lowest strength out of all of them, and the results are pretty apparent as to why. So the whole top of the weld didn't have much for fusion into the plate here, and essentially it just broke off. A desirable result will be like the push and the pull, where it kind of more or less breaks down the middle of the weld, and that is desired over this. Now, had I done 10, 15 of these same tests, maybe some of them would have done better than this, but I can tell you by looking at the weld pool when I was welding with a straight-in angle, it just seemed to me like the molten pool was pushing all around, and I was just welding on top of it more so than staying on the leading edge. So again, MIG does not have very much penetration through a molten puddle, and the thicker the puddle is, the worse off your root fusion's going to be. Now, when you look internally in here, it's basically a completely untouched edge. It got right to that edge, and then that was it. So again, no root fusion, no penetration beyond the root, and poor sidewall fusion. So I would definitely say, again, this is only one test, but straight-in angle, you want to avoid that simply because you have no ability to stay on the leading edge, and the weld's going to be significantly weaker. Now let's look at the push. All right, so here's the push angle plate, and you can see better performance. The weld more or less broke down the middle of the plate instead of off of one side. And you can see this here where it kind of broke off of this top plate. And if you've watched any of my videos, you probably already understand why. But this has a lot to do with cold starts with MIG. And by the way, this affects stick even more so. So you're not out of the woods with stick either. But when you start and you get motoring on, what ends up happening is the lack of heat at the beginning of the weld creates a situation of a lack of fusion for the first 3/8 to ½ inch, and that's why this broke off of this plate like this. And this is kind of, how do I put it, to be expected. Now, adjusting run-in speed, inductance, all sorts of stuff, and manipulating the puddle a little bit at the start can play a role in eliminating this. But I didn't, this is a simple test. I just ran all the same settings for all the plates. Especially this would be true if your welder simply doesn't have like inductance control and run-in speed control. This is what you're going to be dealing with. So part of the reason why the push broke at a lower result than the pull is due to this little bit of lack of fusion at the start. However, when we look at the internals of it, this doesn't look that bad. We have some breakdown of the plate here. We have a little bit at the start, and it's hard to see because of all the crap that's kind of in here from when it broke. But for the most part, the original edge is not broken down at all. There's really very little to no root fusion, but I would say it's a little bit more than the straight-in angle. And simply because of the better sidewall fusion this had and a little bit more root fusion at points gave this that much more strength over the straight-in. Now let's look at the pull. All right, so here's the pull angle. As you can see, the weld broke straight down the middle, which is the most desired result. It is favoring the bottom plate a little bit here, more so than the top plate. It's not bad, but overall a very acceptable result. Now this one took more force than I was able to do because I ran out of room to bend it. I ended up putting it in the shop press to break it the rest of the way because it still was pretty well attached. Well, let's take a look at the inside of it to get some ideas as to what was going on. So when you look at the inside, we have some fusion here at the start. If you notice, it doesn't have nearly as bad of a lack of fusion at the within that first ½ inch. So that was a lot better than with the push angle. And then when you get down here, most of this edge is broken down, but at this section, it completely chewed through, and that's about a ½ inch section. We're looking at it up close pretty far. And then, of course, at the end, it nipped the plate and bit in here. And this right here probably mattered a lot for the actual strength of this. And I've done a video where I tacked the corners down on this and bent it, and the amount of strength having fusion for wrapped corners actually matters quite a bit. So all interesting stuff. The reason I would say that this was so much stronger really had to come down to no lack of fusion that was significant. Like when you look at this, I mean, that complete area didn't even fuse. So it's just a more consistent fusion weld. It has deeper fusion in parts, and then this little bit really helped it. So, you know, even if we took off of this, I know that this would, if I would do, say, 10 tests of each, pretty much looking at this, I think the pull's going to beat it every time. But, you know, we still have more to look at to get better ideas of what's going on. So let's keep going. All right, so let's do some quick book learning on a couple reasons why certain weld profiles increase strength, and this also plays a role, and I didn't mention this earlier. So when you push a weld, it has a tendency to create a profile that's flatter, like this, and when you pull it, it has a tendency to create a more round profile like this. The same effect can happen if you increase voltage really high. It flattens the weld out, and if you run lower voltage, it's going to rope it up. Now, the push versus pull that we saw increased fusion at the root and higher performance with the pull. And one of the confusing things is that when you look at the bead from a side profile, it kind of looks like, not like caulk stuck to the plate, but it's roped up like almost that the weld was cold. And then you see the push and it looks like it's wetted out better, but the actual results in fusion are different among the two. And even though it looks this way, it has better fusion and it turned out to be stronger. Now, there's a couple of reasons why that it was stronger, which I mentioned some of them, but one of the reasons is when you have a profile of a weld like this and say equal fusion between these two, this has to tear through that much distance from this point to this point to rip this top plate off. And having a profile like this also kind of makes it harder to lever against this point right here as these two get pushed together. So you essentially have to tear through this and lever against it, which produces a very strong weld simply because of the mechanical, how do I put it? The mechanical advantage of it. Now, when you look at this, which is kind of more or less like a push weld, the same amount of metal roughly gets deposited. However, it's over a wider area, so it would be like up over here. And the problem with that is when you look from this point to this point, you have lost what's called the throat depth of the weld. And by reducing that, it's going to be easier to tear through that in order to bend this towards the face. And that's also why in this crappy drawing right here, which depicts a concave weld, that a concave weld is extremely undesirable over something like a convex weld, because the throat depth, yeah, you might have a wide weld that looks okay, but you have no reinforcement between the root and this, and that will fail very easy, because not only is it mechanically easier to lever against it, but there's simply less metal to tear through. And that's why, like, not so much with MIG and stick that you have this issue. TIG is really bad with this, where guys don't push enough filler and their whole weld is concave, and that's actually a very weak weld. If you were to stress it, it's very common for it to crack through simply because there isn't enough reinforcement. So I thought I would share this just to help knock some dust off of the rafters on this. So let's go back to the cut and etch of some more material. All right, so what I have here is one push, one pull, 1/4 inch plate, same settings. Obviously, all of these are welded at the same settings for 1/4 inch plate. And I'm just going to chuck this in a vise, cut it in half for both of them, and we're going to look at what's inside. All right, so I cut these and etched them. Let's start by looking at the push. So the push weld, not really the best penetration overall. You can see we're right at where the two plates meet, where the theoretical root is. There's really not a whole lot of fusion, if there is any. That's about all that happened. So not a terrible result, and this is going to be typical of short arc MIG with average settings, nothing really too unusual. So now let's look at a pull angle. So pulling, we can see that the weld isn't quite as flat. It's a little bit more roped up, but the penetration is actually better. There's no question that the root is fused, and it's fused beyond the root, so we actually do have penetration. And this is why in the previous break test that it actually broke at a higher level, is simply because more of the root was fused. So here where we look at both of them, you can see there's a definite difference. No doubt the pull is roped up a little bit more. Maybe I went a little bit slower and it deposited a little bit more metal. But again, there's more root fusion in it. The penetration in the sidewall is better. It's subtle, but it's there. And not to mention, it will increase the strength, especially if the weld is stressed towards the face. Away from the face, either one of these, the plates would bend fully before the weld failed. So again, it really depends on what your welding is to whether or not the strength will make a difference. So I don't know if you've noticed what I've noticed so far in making this video, but I would definitely say pulling produces more root fusion and penetration than pushing, which kind of goes against a lot of the conventional wisdom I see on YouTube and the forums all the time, where people always say, make sure you push MIG, push MIG, push MIG. Well, is that really the case? Thus far, everything is pointing towards increased fusion and thus stronger welds when you pull. And it's not just in this video, but in the previous couple videos I did where I was testing circles and stacking dimes versus stringers, I noticed, again, a distinct difference in the fusion in cut and etches when I pulled versus I pushed. And to really iron out the details on this, I did 3 welds with 3/8 plate with settings appropriate for 3/8 plate, or at least what my machine recommended, not necessarily the best end-all be-all settings. And I did 1 straight in, 1 pull, or this one's pull, and then 1 push. And I'm going to cut all these up now and wear out my Sawzall blade to see what's in here with a cut and etch. So let me go and do that, and I'll be right back. Well, I got these all cut up, and I might have to start a GoFundMe to get the cordless Sawzall some needed repairs. It started smoking at about the 2 battery mark cutting this stuff, and well, it's what it gets for, or well, I guess it's what I get for having a dull blade in there, carbide blade with all the teeth broke off. But hey, I made it through it, so we can finish this video up. Let's start by looking at the straight in cut and etch. So on this 3/8 plate, the straight in angle actually has some root fusion and penetration, which is kind of surprising, but the settings are starting to get pretty up there for short arc, I guess. But not too bad of a weld. If this is what you saw on 3/8 plate with short arc, it's decent. Not the best, not the worst, but I would say borderline, definitely acceptable. Here on a push angle, we have a similar weld profile, but you can see how the root basically didn't fuse. We got that little pin dot there. Now all the plates are prepped identical, so it's not likely some kind of contaminant that caused that. And I actually did a few more tests besides this off camera, and they all basically look just like this. So if the root's fused, it's barely, there's no penetration. The weld itself looks good. I mean, it's visually appealing because it's a flatter profile, less roped up per se, but you don't want to see stuff like this on 3/8 plate by any means. Now let's look at the pull angle. So surprisingly enough, the penetration again on the pulling is better. Definitely a roped up weld. Visually, you would probably think the push angle had more penetration just by how it looked
yet here we are with a different bead profile and more penetration. So you really can't judge a book by the cover per se. Now this is getting close to what spray arc does. Obviously I wasn't using spray arc settings or C10 or spray arc gas, but this is actually pretty acceptable, far better than I would have thought would happen with 3/8 plate. So let's look at all of them together. So once again, the overall is really pointing towards the pulling, increasing penetration, and thus producing stronger welds. But the roped up appearance of it is kind of, I wouldn't say undesirable, but in a lot of cases it might be somewhat of an issue. When you look at the push, it's nice and flat. I mean, I definitely like the look of that better, but the results kind of speak for themselves. I don't know about you, but I don't think that I would want the way that the push looks for the root fusion. Definitely not good. All right, I think you've seen enough. Let's move on.
So what did we learn today? Well, I learned that there's a significant difference between pushing and pulling, and far more than I would have thought. And I'm even guilty of telling people that there wasn't that much of a difference in the past. And well, guess what? That came from ignorance. I never tested push versus pull, so I was kind of just spewing out the common internet knowledge, and guess what? The internet can be wrong sometimes. Now, with that said, the caveat to this is a small scale test. I didn't do 1,000 pieces, but I think based on all the evidence that we're seeing, that without a shadow of a doubt, pulling is going to give you more root fusion and more penetration and stronger welds than pushing. And that's on, I would say, 3/16 and up thickness material. If you're welding sheet metal, the penetration is of no concern because you're going to get it no matter what. But with any kind of actual plate, you're better off pulling, in my opinion. And this is one of those things where it's so common for people to just read something like, hey, you always should push, and then, like, just like I did in the past, repeat that to everyone else. And that really stresses, this video stresses the importance of actually testing what you're doing to see what's going on. Because I wouldn't have known any of this, nor would you have likely known any of this if you never tested your welds or you never watched a video like this where somebody else tested it. And that's why it's so important. If you want to make strong welds and you want to know where things are at, you have to do cut and etches or break tests or something, because you don't want to just guess and think everything's okay. That's about the worst case scenario, because you're going to end up with failures. And this really isn't the end all be all on this. I mean, there are certain differences, and whether or not it matters to you, well, really depends on what you're making. But considering how much the performance is better simply by pulling, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull, especially on thicker plate, anytime I can. And sometimes you can't. You might have to push. It is what it is, guys. Like, welding is an imperfect science. You know, you're going to have situations where you can't do everything by the book and you can't get perfectly clean and strong welds. That's life. That's welding. It's never-ending frustration in an attempt to achieve perfection. But I hope that at least this video knocked the dust off the books on the shelf on this and gave you a lot of good insight into making better decisions on what you're making, so that you don't have weld failures or just build super strong stuff that lasts forever. And with that said, if you could do me a favor, and that is, I spent a lot of time making this video. You guys have no idea. And all I'm asking out of you guys is for you to do a couple welds in the next few weeks after this video and do a cut and etch or a break test on it and just see where you're at to get a feel for it. It doesn't take that much time and doesn't even cost that much money. You can pick up this naval jelly to etch with at Harbor Freight, or any hardware store really has this. And as long as you got a decently clean sanded side of the weld, put a little of this on it, give it a couple minutes, wipe it off, and look at where you're at. You might be surprised. You know, no matter what I say or any video on the internet says on some magic settings or what works, what doesn't, you yourself need to test it. So do me a favor and make this video worthwhile. Test something out that you've done and see where you're at. With that said, thanks for sticking around for the video. I hope you learned something. Until next time.